It's time. Time to repair. Time to restore. Time to revive. It's time for the Cure National Policy Summit 2017.
We will just kind of lay out who's with us first and foremost. First, you know, Pastor Ceasar, LeFlore, who was already speaking the other day. We felt like he would be a great added discussion in this. And so, you know, Pastor LeFlore, I've went through his bio before, but he's from Chicago, Illinois. He trumpets the truth on these issues, and we are excited to have him join the panel, and hopefully they're all mic'd up. Are they all mic'd up, by the way? Y'all give him a nod. Wonderful. So, Pastor LeFlore, why don't you come on up as we're doing this, and this is great. And then we have Jonathan Alexandre, and Jonathan Alexandre is right here somewhere. But Jonathan Alexandre is the Director of Public Policy for Liberty Counsel and Liberty Counsel Action in Washington, D.C. He consults with and advises on law and policymakers, including nonprofit and advocacy groups at the federal, state, and local levels across the nation regarding issues on religious freedom, the sanctity of life, marriage and family, foreign domestic issues, Israel, and the Middle East. So he has a plethora of items that he deals with. So prior to that, Alexandre was Assistant General Counsel for the Public Policy Coordinator for the MFI in Boston. So Jonathan, welcome. He's already here. There you go. Y'all give Jonathan a hand. Emily Cow is with us as well. She's an attorney who defended religious freedom for the last 14 years. She worked on behalf of victims of religious freedom at the State Department's Office of International Freedom and the law firm for Juice Kongs, I'm not sure that I said that right, and Beckett Law. She also taught international human rights law at George Mason University. She is currently at the Heritage Foundation, and we appreciate Emily here, and we thank her so much for being a participant with us. Now, and let me get Ryan Baumberger, the man, the myth, the legend. But Ryan is a good friend. He's with the Radiance Foundation. They do incredible work. I only wish I had time to show some of his videos and some of the work that he's done. Just absolutely phenomenal. Really raises the bar on our conversations in the public square on a lot of different issues. But trust me, you will hear more about that in the future. He is known in broadcast media, designer, producer, columnist, passionate factivist, as he calls himself, a factivist, an international public speaker and author. He's an Emmy Award-winning creative professional. And Ryan has an incredible story, but he also has incredible opportunities to address hundreds of thousands of people across this country on, dealing with the issue, several different issues from a fact standpoint regarding marriage, life, and he has an incredible personal story. I mean, if you heard that, we would have to hand out tissues. But his own adoptive story and his own family life is worth the weight in gold as far as hearing that story, but he's a phenomenal person, and so we welcome Ryan to this discussion. Now, last but not least at all, because they always say in Scripture that we save the good wine for last, is Kerri Kupec. Is that correct? Good, wonderful. Kerri Kupec serves as legal counsel and communications director with Alliance Defending Freedom. And we ought to give it an applaud just because it's Alliance Defending Freedom. They have championed so many causes across this country and stood up for what is right. And so since joining ADF in 2014, Kerri has been responsible for East Coast and Supreme Court media operations. Prior to joining ADF, Kupec has served as a law clerk for Honorable William G. Petty of the Court of Appeals of Virginia. She also worked as youth director in Queens, New York, and assisted in directing the Center for Medieval Studies at Fordham University. She's passed the D.C. bar. She's admitted to practice before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. So we definitely welcome Kerri. Kerri's going to kind of join me a little bit, and as she comes on up slightly, and as we walk through this process, she is an attorney. She knows what she's doing on this issue. So I want to welcome everybody for being here. We worked hard on this issue of protecting marriage. Many of you all know that. And many of you all have been around this fight, and you understand that this is a fight that really, we don't have, as I always say it, we don't have the right to redefine marriage and really the right to kind of change it, as we know, because that's above our pay grade. Amen? So if you know me, I've worked in marriage across the country. I worked on Prop 8, was kind of my first indoctrination very quickly. And when I went there, and I'll say this, when I worked on Prop 8, I got asked the question, said, hey, I got a funny call one day. They said, would you be willing to go out and work on Prop 8 in California? And I'm thinking, and it's on the marriage issue. I said, marriage, that should be pretty simple enough. Sounds fundamental to me. And be honest, you know, I went home, talked to my wife, and said, hey, I got this call, asked me what we work on marriage. She said, oh, marriage, oh, sure, we support marriage. And, you know, so we said, okay, well, maybe we should at least pray about this. Okay, so we prayed and got the continued check. Sure, it's marriage. All right, Lord. Okay, good. So we go and do this marriage thing, and I'll be finished in just a second. But so I go out, and so, you know, I get a bunch of other calls saying, hey, this guy's going to be working on marriage. Next thing you know, I'm partnered with Ron Prentice of Protect 8 out there, who was running, the chairman of the campaign was, and it is an interesting story. Never in my life would I have known, I think I was just naive. You know what I'm saying? God sometimes uses your naivety. You know, you're just being naive. I went out and I started just knocking on doors. And when I started knocking on doors about this critical issue called marriage that was on the ballot, they had already done it once in that state, and the people had voted for it in the proposition. But now it was a state constitutional amendment. So another process had already gone forward, and they had to put it on the Constitution. So a lot of people had already checked this off. Pastors had gotten together and actually raised money to help with that process. And so I went and started knocking on some doors. And as I knocked on some doors, some of the pastors that I knocked on doors would say, man, hey, don't come knocking over here. This is a political issue. Can't talk about that. And I said, excuse me? That must have got a bad connection. Political issue? This is marriage. This is the first, you know, this is one of the first institutions created. I just thought it was, hey, everybody believes in marriage. You're a church, got a cross, marriage. I thought it was cool. And believe it or not, I started getting, you know, I was, my old sales hat had to come on, because in sales you're taught, you know, you got to get 5 no's before it's a real no. And so I had to put on that sales hat and say, hey, I know you just didn't say that, so we need to have a discussion. And I kept doing that over and over again. And through a lot of those efforts, you know, there's been several people here. Pastor Ron Hilf back there, it was interesting. We were talking, I said, I know you. He says, McCoy. I said, remember Prop 8? And they said, oh, yeah. So it was a lot of people that we were knocking on doors with. Bishop Frank Stewart, incredible man who has been incredible with marriage. He was like trying to host some pastors together. He looked at me almost like I was half crazy, but you know, he said, I don't know, Derek, this is marriage. I don't know. I'm thinking, hey, marriage is good. But I said, we know we're going to stand up for it. And I just tried to do everything we could, because I felt it was a fundamental belief and a fundamental value that we got to stand for. And a passion rose up in me that said, hey, we have to do this as a church and as a body and get pastors together. So I continued on, and it was just critical for us to continue that. I told pastors over and over again, and I think Pastor Godot had to go out, but he was another critical one up in Sacramento. And there's several others across the state of California that I could talk about that are even here. But as we did that, one of the things you need to understand is I started telling pastors, I ended up leaving, once we won the issue in California. The people voted for marriage in California defined between a man and woman. They voted for that. Matter of fact, twice. It wasn't until it was like a whimpering, whiny party of people that when the day the vote came down, they started stopping traffic in the middle of the street. They started throwing things and demolishing property of churches and some of the people who had aligned with us on this issue. And so you saw quickly whose voice was trying to be silenced. And it wasn't just an issue of, you know, one of those things where, hey, you know, we're upset, we acquiesce because we did the fair process of voting. No, they threw a fit. People didn't know in California, because I was there. I was at a church that was championing this stuff like you would not believe, have their own sub-campaign going on right down in Chino Hills. If you were standing on corners, if you were driving with the bumper sticker on, they were throwing bricks in your window. They would do things that was just unbelievable, saying, in the name of tolerance, and being the most violently intolerant people I have ever met in my life, and saying, I thought this was a fair process that we go to the ballot box and voice our opinion. Let the people vote. Democracy. But I saw stuff that will forever change my life, and it began to be almost a war zone out there in California for a while you were talking about this issue. I went on quite a bit, and I got stories beyond belief, but I won't bother you with those. Later, we came back to Maryland after some years, and then ended up working with folks that are in this room as well. Tried to work in D.C. a little bit, but then I got some real champions in this room where we had to fight legislatively on that issue. Won it one time legislatively, and then had to do a ballot initiative from square one, because the Maryland legislature voted to put it on the floor and then to vote on this marriage issue. Now, let me help you understand, too, and I know this is a long piece, and I'm sorry, Kerri, but this gives framework. And the piece of it is every piece along the way in these battles, it was corrupt. It was not a pure process. The corrupt process that happened in Maryland and Washington and Maine, but especially I know in Maryland personally, is that the governor was behind people. The governor paid off 2 pastors I know of personally. Let me help you understand. Delman Coates and Dante Hicks. 2 pastors that he brought to the Maryland legislature in front of people, and he sat them down, and they sat there in front of the Maryland legislature on a manipulated process, by the way, because at the judiciary, they could not get the votes to get it out on the floor. So he combined the other committee, the health committee, with the judiciary committee that he had already bought and pimped, and put them together to be able to get the votes out, to be able to get it on the floor. Never happened in the process of Maryland legislative history. So in order for that to happen, then he got those guys to testify and stand there in front of people and say, well, we have evolved, equality is right, and I don't know why all of these preachers are bashing about marriage. One of the things we fundamentally told them consistently is that this is, while it's about marriage between one man and one woman and the fundamental breakdown of the family and everything else, I also said, hey, look, your voice is going to be silenced if you do not push this issue. Your religious freedom, and they said, what's religious freedom? Hey, that means your ability to have free speech in this country is about to be shut down if we don't stand up for this issue. Because, see, I think we were at a turning point. And really, it's one of those points where you see all of these things happen, and it's just really critical that we continue to champion this cause. So with that point, can we talk freely? I'm going to invite Kerri up here, and she's going to lay out the rest of this, and we're going to have a panel discussion on this thing. But let me let Kerri come up and kind of give other framework. Thank you.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for having me here on behalf of Alliance Defending Freedom. We are very thankful for this opportunity to talk to you about some real-life victims that are occurring right now in our everyday lives, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, who are under significant government attack simply for living consistently with their Christian convictions and their faith. I'm so grateful for the leadership of CURE and Star Parker, Reverend Deborah McCoy, Dean Nelson, and all of these great folks that you all work with. As was mentioned, I'm an attorney from New York. I was a youth director in Queens. I almost went on staff with Campus Crusade, and then I went to law school instead, and I'm here now. And I can tell you that what I do now is I tell everyone it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. It's a gift from God to be able to stand with people, Christians, our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, who are taking significant hits for standing for truth and standing for the gospel, so that we all will continue to have our freedom to be able to do so, is what I consider my life's greatest privilege. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here today and share with you a little bit about these clients and these people that I get to spend so much time with. We are at a significant point in our history. And here's the thing, I say that, and then I always feel like people say that, people say that, every 5 years, and they've probably been saying that for the last 300 years, right? But I do think we are in a particularly significant point in our history with respect to religious freedom. Never before, at least to my knowledge, have we seen people of faith, specifically Christians, under attack and facing severe government punishment simply for living consistently with their Christian faith and the teachings of Jesus. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some of these, just the human faces of what I'm talking about exactly. The first is Baronelle Stutzman. You may have heard of her. She's the 72-year-old grandmother florist in Washington State. She's a great woman. All of them are. I love these people like they're my own family, and they've become my own family in many respects. Baronelle runs a flower shop there called Arlene's Flowers. She took it over from her mom, and her mother's name was Arlene's, after her mother came down with Alzheimer's. And she started running the shop, and she creates custom floral design and sells flower arrangements for all kinds of events and occasions. She had a particular customer named Rob, who she was very close to. She served him for 9 years. She knew Rob was gay. Rob knew that Baronelle was a Christian. No problem. They were friends. They had a very, very good relationship. And she often would create custom floral arrangements for both him and his partner for many, many years. Well, one day, Rob came in and said that he was marrying his partner, and would Baronelle create custom floral design to celebrate a same-sex marriage ceremony? So think about it for a minute. This is her friend and customer of 9 years. So this is not easy. This is real life. This is your human friend. This is tough stuff. So she prayed about it, and she talked with her husband, and then she met with Rob and said, Rob, I'm sorry. I love you, but because of my faith as a Christian, I just can't participate in a ceremony that directly violates the biblical teachings on marriage. And he was okay with it. They talked about where else he could go. She referred him to 3 other florists in the area that she said, in her own words, who she knew would do a good job. And they even talked about how his mom would walk him down the aisle. So they parted as friends. Next thing you know, Rob's partner had posted some things on Facebook about the whole incident. The Attorney General came after Baronelle, and this is in the state of Washington, and the ACLU, in really an unprecedented attack, because here's why. They came after her both corporately and personally. So they decided to go after not just her as a business, but her personally as well. So what does that mean? So that if Baronelle loses her case, and she's been losing it all the way up, by the way, she doesn't just stand to lose her business, but she actually is going to lose her home, her retirement, and her life savings simply for declining to participate in this one religious ceremony that directly violates her faith as a Christian. And sometimes people don't believe this. They think it's like a spin, it's a scare tactic. Well, she's not really, but she actually really is. The attorney's fees on the other side have gone up so high. We asked the ACLU to drop them, but they've doubled down, and they've refused to do so, knowing it's going to bankrupt her at 72 years old. So her case is currently pending before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to decide on December 1st whether or not they take up the case, and they'll hear it. But her case is directly tied to the next case that is at the Supreme Court right now, and that's the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop. I'm sure some of you have heard of him as well, Jack Phillips. He's a cake designer out of Lakewood, Colorado. Just a stand-up, regular guy who's been running his business consistently with his faith for many, many years. He chose the name Masterpiece in the early 90s based on the scripture verse that talks about not having 2 masters. And the logo is an art palette, and there's paintbrushes, and he's an artist. He always has been. Then he discovered he could combine his love of art with his love of baking, and creates all kinds of really beautiful custom creations for people who come through his shop stores. One thing I'd like to mention about Jack is that there are a number of things that one could see that he's a Christian. You go into his shop, there's Christian literature everywhere. In fact, I said to him, Jack, this is such a Christian cake shop. And he said, really, why? And I said, well, there are a lot of Bibles in here. That's interesting. And there's literature and all these kinds of things. So if you go in there, you know what's going on. And he keeps his shop closed on Sundays. He doesn't do cakes for Halloween. He doesn't do anti-American cakes. There's a lot of things that Jack doesn't do, which is customary for creative professionals and artists. And I know Ryan will talk about that a little later, that every artist has a no list. This is part of being an artist, right? You have things that you do and you don't do. So Jack, a same-sex couple came into his shop, and they asked him to create a custom wedding cake for to celebrate their same-sex wedding ceremony. And Jack apologized and instead said, I can sell you anything else in my shop. And it was because of his Christian faith. Well, they swore at him, they flipped him off, they left, they proceeded to sue him, and he lost at both levels of court that he was at. And what was particularly upsetting was his first hearing, if you will, was before something called the Commission, the Human Rights Commission in Colorado. And the commissioner, so this is an official government, this is someone officially acting in their government capacity, compared Jack's Christian beliefs on marriage to that of a perpetrator of the Holocaust and slave owners. Wow. So why was that particularly egregious, you know, obviously without it just being so on its face, was that Jack's father, little did they know, had fought in World War II and was actually part of the first American military unit that had liberated prisoners from Nazi concentration camps. So you can imagine how deeply hurtful that was to be compared to the perpetrator that his very father fought to end. Jack's case will be heard, we think, sometime this fall. The Supreme Court agreed to take it up. And we could be at the end of November, early December. And I think it's obvious why the Supreme Court did. In America, creative professionals, artists, Christians, Muslims, Jews, right? This is not just about Christianity. Christians aren't the only ones that believe marriage is a man-woman union. This stretches across the major faiths of the world. And it's stretched across race, culture, and time. This is old news. This is nothing new or novel. But the Supreme Court recognizes that there's a lot at stake here. Should Christian artists, creative professionals, people be allowed to continue to create expression and design consistent with their conviction without threat of the government destroying them? Last but not least, the last person I'd like to introduce you to today, it's one of my favorite people, Chief Kelvin Cochran. He's not here today, but he was the former Atlanta fire chief. And we're going to show a video about him in a minute. He was born in Louisiana. He was the youngest to a single mom. He rose to become the chief, essentially, firefighter in this country. He was appointed by President Obama to U.S. Chief Fire Administrator in 2008, was brought back to the city of Atlanta, won all kinds of awards, you know, probably like one of the greatest firefighters that's ever lived. And, but I'm going to let him tell you his story.
When I was growing up in Shreveport, the grown-ups asked us all the time, what do you want to be when you grow up? And my answers were always the same. I told them that I did not want to be poor because we were very poor, that I wanted a family because my dad had left my mother, and that I wanted to be a firefighter. Being one of the first African Americans on the Shreveport Fire Department had significant challenges. There was a designated bed in the dormitory for the black firefighter. We had designated plates, forks, and spoons so that no one would eat from the same plates, forks, and spoons of the black firefighter. It gave me a conviction that should I ever be in a position of leadership, that I would never allow anyone to have the same experience I had as a minority. And so when I became fire chief, I instituted having no racism, sexism, territorialism, favoritism, cronyism, or any ism that would interfere with a wholesome work environment for any people group within the fire department. 8 years after serving as fire chief in Shreveport, I was appointed fire chief in the city of Atlanta. President Obama was elected, and he appointed me to the highest fire official in the United States of America, the United States Fire Administrator. And I loved that job and was serving there for about 10 months. The city of Atlanta elected a new mayor and recruited me back to the city of Atlanta, and I served him for 5 years when I was terminated from employment. Given the efforts that myself as fire chief of Atlanta and our group put together in creating this inclusive, diverse, tolerant organization, I was really surprised that writing a book for a Christian men Bible study, 162 pages encouraging men to be the husbands and fathers and leaders that God has called us to be, would put me in an adverse position against the city of Atlanta because of a few pages I wrote explaining biblical marriage and biblical sexuality. In fact, the city of Atlanta conducted an investigation and found out that I had never discriminated against anyone. However, I was terminated after my 30-day suspension in spite of that. After having lived a life of discrimination, providing leadership that eliminates discrimination was a high priority for me. So having been terminated for the perception of discrimination was very, very hurtful and really drives my passion for seeking justice and the fight for truth.
I'm personally hoping that Chief makes a run in 2020 for President of the United States, because he's got my vote. But one thing I would just like to add before we start with our group, and this is going to be a great discussion, is that I want to be very clear about something. This is not about denial of service, right? Because that's the thing that typically comes out all the time. This is not at all. Our clients, these people, Jack Phillips, Barronelle Stutzman, Chief Cochran, Blaine Adamson, and a whole host of others, they serve everyone who walks through their doors, no matter who they are, no matter what their walk of life is, no matter what their background is, and many of them employ people who identify as LGBT and who have all kinds of different life stories. This is about one issue, and this is about the future of freedom of Christians and people of faith. Will they have that freedom to continue to be Christians and to not be forced by the government to participate in something that directly violates who they are and their faith?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. And really, to that end, we felt that this panel would be so appropriate, and even as we've titled it, because we believe that people should not be penalized for believing and living out their faith and what they believe. See, some of you all are, workers in churches. I get that. You're pastors, you're leaders, but you also have congregants that are in business and are entrepreneurs, and you need to be able to instruct them and tell them what to do, how to do it, and how should they react if these claims come against them. We've heard it said, if people like us that want to preserve, religious protections of faith are similar to people, to segregation in the civil rights era, or, going against that. And I think that's not necessarily the case. See, when you begin to equate my belief that I have a voice to some civil rights violation, I get violated by that comment. And I'm really challenged by that comment. I've also heard it said that, this thing, and this works me to even say this, trust me. But, that this is the new black. That gay is the new black. I mean, they put out a documentary on this thing, Reverend Thomas back there always likes to tell people about this. But they put out a documentary on it. It was done, to me, I think with, I wish I could sue. But anyway, I won't go tell you where to get it. But they did talk about gay is the new black. And they were trying to make the point that our position is so marginalized, nobody believes it, and everything else. And ironically, they did this documentary in Maryland when we were going through the fight. The funny thing is that they did not highlight, and I'll say this because this is why we have this distinguished group of panelists, is that the biggest African-American county in the state of Maryland with about 1 million people did not vote for that issue. So if you get the current layout of the state, they never voted for it. They never passed it. They voted against marriage being between a man and woman. Of course, they did not highlight that in that video. So anyway, going on to that point, we have our distinguished panel, and we want to have a discussion about this. Is this okay?
All right, let's do it.
So first, we want to start with Mr. Ryan Baumberger. Ryan, you have such an incredible story and about your family, your life. Why did you get involved in this whole pro-life aspect of things and marriage and these issues? I know they're tough issues, but tell us your story.
And I know we only have a few moments to share, but I'm basically the 1% that is used 100% of the time to justify abortion. My birth mom, despite the horror and violence of rape, still chose to give me life and gave me the gift of adoption. So I grew up in a small family of 15. I have 6 brothers and 6 sisters. 10 of us were adopted. And I grow up understanding how adoption unleashes purpose and how adoption is the essence of salvation. So adoption should be first nature to Christians, not second nature. But also that adoption happens because the natural order of things is broken. And so what adoption does is it ushers in restoration. And I lived that, as did my 9 other siblings who came from all kinds of broken backgrounds. The world said we would be unwanted and unloved. But see, the world hardly ever knows what it's talking about. And my parents defied those low expectations. So growing up in an intact marriage and seeing the way that my father loved my mom loved my father, to me, they display what real marriage equality is. It's the equal value of a husband and a wife. That's marriage equality. And so now as a married father and I have 4 children, 2 of whom are adopted as well, I can't help but be passionate about this issue. I can't help but speak up and stand up. So that's a little bit of my background and why I'm passionate about trying to change this narrative, because gay is not the new black.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Pastor LeFlore, tell us about why you got involved in these issues around, marriage and fighting for what you feel like is right.
Well, thank you. One of the first things that God called me to once I was getting my life to the Lord, I had an awakening, and God called me to defend the sanctity of innocent human life. I heard a sermon by a pastor by the name of Apostle R.D. Hinton, and he preached on twin signs of the times. Out of the 17th chapter of the book of Luke, he says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be when the Son of Man comes. And he started identifying the times in the days of Noah. And he got to the point when he was illustrating violence. And to illustrate violence in this generation, he talked about the abortion issue. Now, up until that time, I think I've heard about abortion, but it never really mattered to me. But once the Holy Spirit had awakened me, I started hearing it with new ears. And I started hearing the heart of God, how God feels about violence against innocent humans. And I thought about who could be more innocent than an unborn baby. And so that started me down a road of social consciousness and awareness. My faith started to impact my public beliefs. I think that's what it's supposed to do. Right. That once God starts changing us, then we have to change our positions on a lot of things. We just can't go along with what's popular and convenient. We have to be willing, as Martin Luther King says, to stand against the prevailing opinions. And so I found my place among individuals like you who would not be afraid to speak the truth on these issues. Because if I could just say this, when I saw the title of this segment,
yes, sir,
about a civil discussion, first of all, I was excited about it until I looked down and saw my name on the panel. Then I said, oh, Lord. But I started thinking about that. I'm saying, so am I really interested in a civil discussion on these issues if the prerequisite is to allow the opposition to frame the discussion and limit the way that we can talk about it? Because I think that's what the enemy has done.
Wow.
It's changed the conversation, what we're allowed to say. It limits what we could say, because when you speak the truth, then they say that's unloving, that's intolerant. So it limits us, and then it changes definitions. So understand this about this homosexuality and this gay marriage issue. They don't want acceptance. They want submission.
Exactly.
Satan is still trying to get Jesus to bow the knee to him. And he's doing that through us. And so now when you come along and say, accept, we don't have the option to be able to offer a counter opinion. Yep. They want us to submit and just go along with that, but we can't. We can't bend the knee.
Good, good. There you go. I think it's going to be a good discussion. Emily, tell us about it. You're at Heritage Foundation. You've been incredibly involved in this fight for quite some time, helping people to really, fight for what they believe and what their morals are. Tell us about what do you think is what we're facing now and where we are.
Well, thank you, Reverend McCoy. Thank you for being so invested in these issues, and thank you to all of you for making the time to really prioritize this. My background is I was born in America, but my family moved to China when I was 14 years old. And so I lived under communism. So I've lived in a country where people don't have freedom. And that's what inspired me to work in international religious freedom. And so for 14 years, I have worked with people all over the world of all faiths in the Middle East and East Asia to protect them from their governments and other members of civil society when they violate their freedoms. So a lot of people ask me, why would you go from working on, the genocide of Christians by ISIS and, torture of Christians in China to working on religious freedom in the US? And it's because I see overseas, I've seen a pattern of attacks where it begins with, first, social marginalization of people because of their peaceful religious viewpoints. The second stage is economic discrimination against people because of their religious beliefs. The third stage is when the government actually criminalizes those beliefs. And then the fourth and final stage is the stage when either the government commits violence against these people or they allow civil society to commit violence without punishment. And so I have seen in the United States, unfortunately, a very rapid decline in the past few years, especially since the Obergefell decision 2 years ago at the Supreme Court that changed the definition of marriage, where there's a rising level of hostility towards people because of their religious beliefs, particularly on these issues of sexuality. And so it's because of this concern that we are going downhill that I switched from doing international religious freedom to working on issues here in the US. But I also want to say America has the most robust protection of religious freedom of any country in the world. We have an amazing legacy and foundation for this country in religious freedom. Religious freedom and people of faith have made this country great. And so I do believe that this is a critical point, as Kerri said, but it's also not too late to protect religious freedom and to ensure that the next generations also have the freedoms that we have enjoyed and that are their inalienable human rights.
Wow. So you saw it going down that fast?
I have definitely seen, and especially in the last few months that I've been working at the Heritage Foundation, a very swift movement from stage one that I talked about, the social marginalization, and I can give several examples, to the economic discrimination. I think that Jack Phillips' case and the Barronelle Stutzman's case combine both elements. You see the demonization of Jack, comparing him to people who perpetrated the Holocaust. That's from a state official. Mm-hmm. That's very powerful social marginalization and demonization of him, to the actual economic consequences of the lawsuits that have been brought against them. As Kerri described, Barronelle is going to lose everything if she loses this lawsuit. Her store, her home, and her entire life savings. Jack was threatened with death threats. His store was picketed and boycotted. So this is all within the last 2 years. So unfortunately, the decline has been very rapid. Wow. But again, it's not too late. So it's time for us to get involved and to speak up. And I just want to say I'm so thankful, again, for you for being here, because you have such a unique and important role in this battle. Yeah. First of all, because you're African American, and so much of the argumentation from the other side is that, as you said, gay is not the new black. So much of the persuasive power has been focused on saying that the LGBT people are suffering the same kinds of discrimination that African Americans suffered under Jim Crow. So you have the personal stories, you have the personal experience, you have the moral authority to debunk this false analogy. And secondly, many of you are in the ministry, and so you have an incredible platform, not only to speak to the members of your communities and your congregations, but really you have the opportunity, the platform, to speak to a wide variety of people in society. People want to hear from people like you who have moral authority and who care about these issues. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. That's good. good. You easily bring me to my next one. Jonathan, you've worked with Youth and Family Enrichment Services in Boston, coordinated Firm Foundation Ministry for college students, and supported the educational and social development of young people from underrepresented racial groups. You know your work full-time as a black attorney on these issues. As Liberty Counsel filed an amicus brief in this support of the Jack Supreme Court case, tell us how important is this issue to you, and especially as a black attorney, what does this mean to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend, and
yes, sir.
Thank you, pastors. I feel comfortable in a room of pastors. My father is a pastor. My father's father was a pastor. My father's brother, my uncle, was a pastor. So naturally, I decided to become an attorney. I sort of fell a little far away from the tree. But these men taught me some basic principles, two principles that have governed the direction of my life and my path as an attorney. The first is that there are timeless truths, things that don't change. The second is that your convictions ought to be your convictions regardless of the audience. I grew up in Massachusetts, and it's in that setting that I really saw these two principles come to light. I lived about 40 minutes away from Plymouth Rock, which is a physical reminder of the foundation of our country, that it was based on religious liberty, that folks came over to this country in order to preserve and create a culture, a civilization based on the freedom to express their religious beliefs. So I grew up in that setting. I also attended an elementary and middle school that were founded by the best friends of Martin Luther King when he was up in Boston. He studied at Boston University and attended a church there. His best friends started a school that I attended, an elementary and middle school. So not only did they instruct us specifically on the civil rights, and we were told of all the experiences there, much of what is told in history, but they also gave us an access to what happened behind closed doors. They let us know of the conversations and the prayer circles leading up to the marches. And I'm sure there are many here that can still remember what it was like to march, the atmosphere, what it felt like, what it smelled like, your feet as they were tired as we continued to strive towards equality. A journey that was at the civil rights era was probably 300 years, 300, 400 years in the making, and continuing till today. A journey that is based and rooted in the inherent principle that all men are created equal. So that was the foundation. That was really the starting point of my life. And so when I was then told that your identity as a black man, your history, your legacy, your culture, who you are, is now co-equal and being compared to individuals that want to identify first by their sexual orientation or their gender identity, you can tell how one would be very offended. How one would see that there is no correlation between the immutable characteristic of a person's race and the actionable aspect of sexual orientation. How one identifies with their sexual behavior and their choice has nothing to do with the unchanging nature of fleecy locks and black complexion. No other culture, no other group of individuals in this country have ever been enslaved as black Americans were, have ever been sold almost as cattle, as property, considered less than human under the law. Another group of individuals have had their businesses burned, their communities and churches destroyed by government permission, save the African Americans. And to say that experience is co-equal to an individual who decides to identify first as their sexual orientation is not only intellectually dishonest, but it is offensive. And so my approach as an attorney is by distinguishing, as the law gives us the tool to distinguish between what is an immutable characteristic of being black, an inherent protected status based on something that can't change, based on a group of people that have suffered disparate treatment, that didn't have access to a political avenue to which they could uphold their rights, and distinguish that from the self-actualization that one has to go through when they want to identify as gay or their sexual orientation, putting the two aside in completely separate categories as the law has given us permission to do. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the foundation on many of these laws that are used to attack folks like Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman. The Title II federal standard that applies to public accommodation was put into place in order to protect civil rights leaders' ability to go through the interstates and have access to hotels and restaurants, not being kicked out of these places where they wanted to have access to their basic human needs. Those laws have now been expanded and changed and distorted and are being used not to prevent discrimination, but as a tool, as a force of discrimination. So as often as we have the opportunity, and Liberty Counsel, as you mentioned, has filed a brief in the court, we separate based on the principles that the law has given us, distinguishing the First Amendment as being sourced in our religious liberty from the founding through today, but also the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act and the ways in which that status of being protected based on an immutable characteristic is very different from the changing, mutable nature of sexual orientation.
You know, you mentioned something. I want to just point this out really quick. Many people probably don't realize those Title II laws that you just talked about that were put in place to advance people from having basic human needs met are now being used as real charters to help force discrimination. Can you expound on that just a minute? Because I think it'll be helpful for people in here in this room to understand. You know, we talk about we know civil rights. Right. We know that era. We know the King era. We know the things that were happening. Help us understand that caveat of when they put that law in place, the mindset of where they were.
Yeah, the mindset was protecting the black race, protecting the immutable characteristic of race, and also expanding that in 1972 to women, the immutable characteristic of being born female. Those are things that are unchanging. Nature has a claim on your skin color. Nature has a claim on your gender. Sexual orientation and gender identity are inherently mutable. Those are changing characteristics. You have to act out on your same-sex attraction in order to claim the status of having your same-sex marriage protected. You have to act out on your gender identity in order to participate as you were in that protected class. And so these laws, as you said, that were put in place, I wouldn't say exclusively, but chiefly to protect race and protect sex, are now being expanded to sexual orientation and gender identity now, and who knows what else in the future.
Wow, that's really interesting. You know, some of us, we hear this thing that, well, you know, this is like the loving case, and you know, when we begin to talk about this is what the rhetoric is. Oh, you're just going down the aisle of trying to keep people separated, and you know, it's just like keeping blacks not marrying whites and things like that. How do you have people respond to arguments like that, Ms. Kupec? And she's over here in the corner, by the way.
I think Jonathan just did a really good job, really kind of just addressing that exact question. But I think the easy response to it is that bans on interracial marriage were designed to subjugate an entire class of people. That was what those laws were all about. And that subjugation ran the gamut of, you know, enslavement to all the things that Jonathan just described, and just horrific things, and truly something that I personally will never be able to wrap my mind around, that our country could have done something and do things like this. But to compare that to Christian artists and Christian creative professionals who serve everyone, who have gay customers, who have gay employees, and simply can't, because of their faith and their identity as a Christian, can't create custom work to celebrate a marriage ceremony that directly violates biblical teachings on marriage, is preposterous. And to take it even out of the context of marriage just for a moment, these same laws, so in Washington, D.C., political affiliation is a protected class. So under this rationale and under these kinds of laws, a Democrat speechwriter would be forced to write speeches for President Trump. Many Muslims have a conviction against visual depictions of Muhammad and Jesus and the prophets, you know, according to Islam. These same laws would force a Muslim painter to paint a mural of Muhammad for a religious customer. So you can imagine this goes on and on and on and on and on. And so this issue transcends marriage, yet marriage is what's driving this entire thing, and it's concerning.
That's really interesting.
Could I jump in and respond to that as well?
Absolutely.
I think we should not accept that framing of the Loving versus Virginia case with the issue of, Christians who support marriage between one man and one woman. I think that's the wrong analogy because of everything that's already been said, because that was rooted in bigotry against a group of people. It wasn't about the idea of marriage. It was about keeping one group of people suppressed. I think the correct analogy is from the abortion context. So after Roe versus Wade, the Congress passed several amendments that allow religious exemptions from performing abortions or financing abortions. And so we have laws that allow medical professionals, because of their religious beliefs or moral convictions, to not perform abortions, and for companies not to finance abortions, or Little Sisters of the Poor not to have to provide contraception. And that's not because those people hate women as a class. It's because they believe that abortion is killing human life. It's their belief about the idea of what abortion is. It's not about the people group keeping women suppressed. And so when you look at somebody like Jack Phillips or Barronelle Stutzman, it's what they believe about marriage. People like them, they try to live according to their conscience at work, and so Jack Phillips has also declined orders to do a cake celebrating divorce because of what he believes about marriage. It's not because he believes divorced people, need to be suppressed or they're a lower class. It's what he believes about marriage. And he serves, of course, divorced people. Because it's not about the person, it's about the event, it's about the message. So all of these people who are involved in these lawsuits, none of them are saying, we won't let people who are gay come into our store, we won't sell them anything. In fact, they have been serving them for years, as in the case of Barronelle. She served her customer for 9 years. Jack offered them anything in the store, cupcakes, brownies, anything off the shelf. He just couldn't endorse that message about marriage by creating a custom cake, just like he couldn't endorse a message about divorce. And I believe like other people would not endorse a message about polygamy. It's the idea of marriage that is what is bothering their conscience. It's not what they think about gay people.
Well, can I just jump, I'm sorry, just for just a moment, as someone who is interracially married, even though my foundational belief is that we are all one human race, but that aside, being in an interracial marriage, these anti-miscegenation laws which were passed, which actually came after, the colonialization of America, because interracial marriage was actually allowed and then disallowed. But throughout human history, there have always been interracial marriages because of what marriage actually is, and it can only be defined between a man and a woman. So that whole false narrative that somehow, the LGBT plight and same-sex marriage, is the same as the Loving versus Virginia issue and interracial marriage, and it's not the same because, the interracial couple getting married didn't change the essence of what marriage is between a man and a woman. I mean, just having a slightly different skin pigmentation doesn't change the essence of marriage. Having a male and a female marrying changes the whole essence of marriage. So as someone who's in an interracial marriage, I reject the comparison, but they're not relying on people actually using common sense. It is really predicated on just the emotional part of all of it. Right. Because when you invoke black civil rights, you invoke something very powerful. I mean, and so many go along with it, which is, there's so many differences, there's so many contrasts. I mean, how many black individuals in here had to come out of the closet? Anybody? Did any of you have to come out of the closet? No. Boom, right there. There are so many differences between the LGBT plight and the black civil rights fight. Just saying.
Just saying. Well, let me ask you this question, Ryan. As a creative professional, I got two sides of this question.
Okay.
They're getting your, y'all coming out the closet? But as a creative professional, as somebody who has their own business, you got, you're doing, you do creative business as well. Two sides. One, I really want to hear your perspective on what do you feel like is next in this case? What do you feel like is a good way to frame it? What are you things that we could do? But really, before that, asking you as a business professional, and if somebody's coming to you on those issues, what do you do? And you know what I'm saying? If somebody's coming, said, hey, I want you to come and do creative video on my wedding that I just did, or whatever else. I mean, you're extremely talented. I'm just kind of curious, as a business guy, what's your frame of thinking?
Yes, keep in mind, having gone through 2 years of a lawsuit with the NAACP for being sued for parroting their name, and thank you, Alliance Defending Freedom, because you represented us and we prevailed. But to be sued over parroting an organization's name, free speech is a really crucial thing for me. And as a creative professional, to have the freedom to be able to create for different kinds of events, different kinds of causes, I want the freedom to be able to say yes and no. In fact, I had a particular case that a few years ago, I guess they could have sued me, where I had a group, an ad agency in Atlanta that wanted to work on a human rights exhibit. And part of the human rights exhibit, of course, was the LGBT exhibit. And I explained to them, I'm with you on some of the other facets of this project, but I am not aligned there. I don't agree with that, and so I'm going to have to respectfully decline a pretty huge project. It was quite a bit of money for me, and I declined it. But I wouldn't have that kind of freedom if the left gets its way. I would not be able to decline what types of causes I design for. And that's scary for me as a business professional, that I literally would have to say yes to every single cause, to every politician. For instance, I used to run an ad agency with two buddies of mine, that we'd have to accept every politician who wanted us to create an ad for them. No, I want the freedom to be able to act on my First Amendment rights, my guaranteed First Amendment rights, my rights of conscience, my freedom of association, free speech, and of course, religious liberty. But to me, it's terrifying, not only to be threatened with being sued, but all the things that would follow. To be able to lose my entire livelihood, I can't even imagine what Barronelle Stutzman is going through, what Jack Phillips is going through. But that is what all of us will go through. So that's why I say the justice for Jack is actually justice for all.
And I would say, too, as far as what they've lost, what we've talked about, Barronelle, Jack's lost 40% of his business, which means he's had to lay off over half his staff. It's only his family really working for him now. And obviously, just the list goes on. And with the death threats, he's had to hide his daughter and his granddaughters in the back of his shop because he got a call saying that he knew where, someone knew where they were and they were going to come and get them and take them down. It's terrifying stuff. Wow.
So what do you see, and I appreciate that, Kerri, that's really good, because I'm coming right back to you on my last question, but the other one, what do you see is happening leading up to this Masterpiece case? What do you see us getting involved with, or in that regards, or how it should be framed? Just kind of curious.
We can't be afraid to engage, whether it's at the pulpit or whether it's in our workplace. We can't be afraid to engage. We know the truth. I mean, and we understand in the eternal how truth sets us free. It also sets us free here in this temporal space. And we have to be willing to speak up. We have a great project actually that we're asking African American leaders to help us debunk this whole myth that gay is the new black by speaking from their own experiences. Those who grew up during the civil rights era. I'm not quite that old, but there are wait, I didn't mean old. Hold on, let me rephrase that.
Mature.
I was not blessed to be able to go through that and come out, even stronger. But we're working on this project video where we're capturing just your take on why the LGBT plight is nothing like the blood-bought civil rights fight. In fact, we're doing that today in the studio just about 8 minutes from here, so anyone who can participate, it only takes 15 to 20 minutes of your time. But this is crucial because the other side has their narrative. And when they come out, the first thing they're going to go to is, this is just like the civil rights fight. No, it's not. No, it's not. There's so many reasons why it's not. Here's another case in point of why it's not the same. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference had about $300,000 in their budget the year before the Civil Rights Act of '64. That's equivalent to about $2.3 million today. HRC, Human Rights Campaign, the year before marriage was all of a sudden redefined, had $16.1 million in their budget. In fact, today they have a larger budget, $49 million, versus the NAACP, which has $29 million in their budget. I mean, LGBT plight is corporate sponsored. I don't remember Coca-Cola at the march on the march in Washington. Does anybody remember? Corporations, advertising, for all that? No, we don't have that. So there are so many differences. So I encourage you, one way that you can actually be involved is to be in that video. But for those of you who can't, your voice, wherever you are, you have to, and do it in love, because loving every human being, we have to understand, does not mean loving every human doing.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So we're doing all this in love, but we have to understand wherever we are, wherever our spheres of influence are, we have to be willing to speak out, because, as you said, it isn't too late. It's not too late.
And then let me just ask Kerri real quick, as we are getting ready to close. I know we have a timeline. What are some of the things we can do to support the case? And, practically from that side of it, get involved in that regard?
Well, first pray for the Supreme Court justices and pray for this case and the attorneys as we figure out the best way to go about doing all that we're doing. But pray especially for the clients. Pray for, Jack Phillips, Barronell Stutzman. We've obviously explained the toll this has taken on them, but these are human beings. So you can imagine how they're feeling. And I was just with Blaine Adamson. He's our T-shirt printer. He's part of the whole pile of cases, and they go through some tough stuff, and it takes a toll. This is not just an emotional toll, a physical toll, but a spiritual toll as well. So just pray that God continue to strengthen them and give them the courage to stand, not just for what they're doing, but they're standing for us. They really are. They're standing for our freedom, everyone in this room. The second thing is, if you'd consider joining us, Allison Howard's back there. She's one of my colleagues and does just a fantastic job at Alliance Defending Freedom. And we're working all together on a rally that will take place outside the Supreme Court. It's called Justice for Jack. And we would love to give you information on when that will be. We don't know when the court arguments are happening yet, probably last week of November, first week of December, but we really would love a great showing and everyone coming out for that. We want to show the world and the media that, these people are not alone. There are a lot of people who believe this and feel this way, and they understand what's at stake. And lastly, and this is not exactly related, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this, but it ties into the whole free speech component, which is the Free Speech Fairness Act. Reverend McCoy is going to talk to you a little bit more about that, but that's all that is restoring back to pastors their freedom to be able to freely share from the pulpit and apply Scripture to all areas of life, because I don't know about you, but I think pastors should be determining from the pulpit what they say, not the IRS. So if there's a coalition letter going around. We need signatures on that, October 1st. You can talk to Allison Moore, and if you want to speak more about that, that would be great.
Wow, this has been really good. Have you enjoyed this? This is a huge discussion that needs to take place quite a bit more. I could go down the line and keep talking to each one, the rich history of what Emily's been doing for years, and I'm just so fascinated by her seeing that communist perspective and then also understanding where we are in our culture today and seeing those alignments, and then her courage to join in and jump in this fight in the U.S. That's huge. The other side of Pastor LeFlore being out there in the front lines, hearing the inspiration of somebody really talking to him about these issues, and then correspondingly being engaged on these issues. That's how it takes place. That's how it happens. And then, going to even Jonathan, there's so much you could say there, and just even as he kind of articulately shared with us about those components and what this really means for this generation coming forward. And then we want to thank Kerri, and then also Ryan over here, who is, I call him the creative genius. He has so much stuff oozing out. It's like God just poured out and just kept going on this brother, but that's okay. Maybe we get the overflow every now and then. But anyway, it's an important discussion that needs to be had. The Free Speech Act, basically, which Kerri was referring to, we will be getting that out to you absolutely. That is one of those things we want to make sure it stays on your plate. We talked a little bit about it yesterday in terms of that Johnson Amendment aspect and how it all relates to your ability to have speech in your pulpit. You are not to be silenced. There shouldn't be a muzzle on you. There shouldn't be even a threat of a muzzle on you. And so we want to make sure that that voice is full bar, wide open. You can say what you want to say. And so we're going to sign on to it. We're going to be soliciting you to sign on to it, get your friends and other folks to sign on to it. I think it's a good foundational piece of legislation and things we need to support. So let's give them another round of applause. I know we have to kind of end.
If you have any questions, please contact the Cure's National Clergy Network office at 202-479-2873 or visit our website at urbancure.org